perceptions about how to balance the economy, to make it work better for a wider degree of people. I don't know how to summarize that in one word, but
Can you one word?
It's one of the others.
The one word answer.
I would say technology and all the discrepancies that it's creating.
And technology a force for good or ill?
For good.
Good?
For good.
We all agree is good?
I would say you have to look at both sides of the coin.
Yeah,
Right.
agreed.
Because technology is propelling globalization, and we're talking about some of the negative aspects of globalization too.
But think of the health aspect. I mean, technology can alter health. If you're thinking technology in countries where you're not having a medical, how do you say this? You know, you're not enough doctors available.
Right.
You can use technology a lot and enable people. We've seen that. The village doctors and all these things. So I think pre-diagnostic of illnesses. So I think technology in its good. And it's not, I don't think it's the economic side only. I think it's the ability of technology, if it's deployed for the good side, that could do a lot of change.
I was struck by what Tim Cook said recently, the CEO of Apple, of course, that he thinks Apple's future is in health. Mm-hmm. So there's watches that sort of measure your heartbeat. So don't be shy. Please, and introduce yourself.
I'm advocating for farmers from India and the developing world. We're talking about globalization, we're talking about WTO. Where does agriculture fit in? Because normally when you have trade disputes like between China and America, you're talking about trade deficits and things like that. But when you look at agriculture, you're talking about livelihoods. And I would want to see that where do we see in the next 10, 20 years about how agriculture is going to be impacted with this globalization, because millions and millions of people are impacted because of how WTO was signed and how it's got very grave implications. In fact, many farmers in the developing world actually cheered the US president when he said he's walking out of WTO.
Who wants to address this? Rick, you want to give it a try?
I mean, that's why I used the word rebalancing before, is I think we're going to have a kind of a rebalancing of priorities in domestic policy, but it'll affect trade as well. And one of them is in this area. You know, for 10, 15 years, people tried to get a very liberal approach to agricultural trade done in negotiations, and that never succeeded. And I do think that things have shifted and people recognize that we need to rebalance a bit and understand the livelihoods question that you're talking about, and that we need to have a bit more of a flexible and hybrid approach to allow countries to maintain rural livelihoods while not, unduly discriminating and shutting off their markets. So we need to find a better balance in that regard.
In the U.S., I think something like 5% of the population produce all the food for the people. In China, it used to be 20, 30 years ago, it used to be 95% producing for 100%. Today, I think it's only about 15%. And all of that is because of technology, and all of that because of globalization. So I think with globalization, if it is allowed to flourish without the pollution of politics and geopolitics and so on, a lot of good things can happen in the agricultural sector. As an example, there are so many direct flights from Thailand to Israel. And it is not without any reason. It's all this agricultural technology, and that's why Thailand has become, this agricultural country. On the other hand, I come from Indonesia. They would not allow to have even one flight to Israel. They would not even allow Indonesians to go to Israel. So you miss out some of these things. I'm using extremes. So I think the right kind of globalization should allow benefits to flow through the agricultural sector.
Yeah, and the point is, there are never ever any agreements which last forever and they are right forever. So to ask for a level playing field is not wrong. The US says we want to have a level playing field in certain areas, that's true, but other countries should ask the same. It's not, the agreements are fitting to a certain purpose. Of course, then we started, the emerging countries, should gain more. China is not any longer an emerging country. Should not be treated as an emerging country. That is changing, and therefore we need a discussion about that, how we rebalance certain things, and that's a completely legitimate question to raise. And I'm not saying all the agreements we did 20 years ago, 15 years ago, or whatsoever are always right forever.
There's a question right here in front on the couch.
Yes. Hi, Alexander Stubb. I'm the former Prime Minister of Finland, currently with the European Investment Bank. Given that Matt did a multiple choice question, if you'd allow me to go for two true or false hypotheses. The first one is, do you think that the notion of multilateral trade agreements a la WTO are dead? And given that there is a clear power vacuum emerging with the withdrawal of the US from the trading nations, the lead is going to be taken by the European Union through bilateral trade agreements. So do you think the EU will be the trendsetter and the regulator through bilateral trade agreements? Question number one. Question number two, by necessity, do you think that the next level of cooperation between the United States and the European Union is actually going to be in the realm of the digital revolution because of the way in which these two continents think about artificial intelligence and about privacy, which is really the opposite way in which things are looked upon in China. So my question is, do you think that the EU and the US will forge a merger on digitalization against China? And then the other one was, and final point, Matt, you mentioned health. Apple is a little bit out of it. I'm wearing a Finnish ring called Oura, which actually measures all of my vital signs in real time and has an app that goes through my pulse. Right now it's quite low, 46, so we're doing okay.
I'm not an Apple shareholder, I just said this. Okay, I like quizzes. Who wants to start?
I have a clear preference that we reinvent WTO, multilateral, but if that doesn't work, then it's better to do bilaterals instead of doing nothing. So that would be my answer on the first subject. The second point was again? Yeah, I think we have so much in common in the US and Europe, and I think we should strive to have one alignment how we deal with data and how we protect privacy of individuals. And just because we are on the short end some conflicts doesn't mean that we should not strive for getting aligned on the long run.
Let me say, I think things started bilateral and then it expanded to multilateral. But I think it's going to be a combination. While it seems that from the US and China, there seems to be some breakdown, but other discussions and negotiations continue on. I think from a business perspective also, we see that things before used to be so simple, just bilateral. It has become multilateral, but it's a combination of all that. So I would say that it will be a much more dynamic system. On the second issue, on the technology digital side, it's all coming to the competitions on the 5G. There's going to impact life. It's going to be impact the infrastructure for everything that happens over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And the reality is it is starting to polarize with the developing countries going maybe more EU and the US, and then the developing countries into Huawei. So I think the reality is like that.
Slightly different way of asking you, is the future clash between China and Europe/the US a military clash, a trade clash, or a technological rules clash?
Future.
He's punting that one to me.
But I don't want you to duck Alex's question either, his two true or false.
I think there are elements of all that we're going to see, and that this is going to be the art of statesmanship. To manage this well, because we're so interdependent that to manage this in a clumsy way will be in everyone's, they'll do harm to everyone. But on the WTO question, I think the WTO survival depends on the WTO being able to embrace a more variable geometry than its traditional, everybody's got to sign on the dotted line. Right now, the rules in the WTO are not very hospitable for groups of countries, even large groups of countries, to negotiate something as a forward group that then the rest of the organization can accede to later on. That needs to change. And then the second part is, even in a more variable geometry world, there's still a really crucial role for the WTO, the multilateral system. There are currently 400 preferential trade agreements, usually regional trade agreements. There are 3,000 plus investment treaties in the world. It's such a maze of different rules that companies operating globally, let alone small businesses that are trying to export into different markets, have to navigate. Nobody but the WTO could do a better job than beginning to stitch together better coherence among this patchwork quilt. And that's a future way for the WTO to renew and refresh its utility in the world. Last thing, very quickly, on the digital and the data. EU, US, actually, I think tomorrow we're going to hear from the Japanese Prime Minister on his agenda for the G20 this year. And I believe you will hear a significant new emphasis in this area. So I think the EU and the US can provide leadership, but I suspect it will not only come from those two. And I would look for a larger coalition moving, maybe led by the Japanese, we'll see.
Maybe if you allow, I would like to follow up on James. If James' hypothesis is right that we get 5G networks, I don't know how we should run a global company any longer. Because one camp will say you have to operate on that network, and the other one, and then how we exchange information. I can't imagine if that really happens. I don't know how we should ship any of the high-tech products from China to the US and vice versa. How should we manage the data? Is the data center then in China different, or do we have to bring everything? And and that is a real problem. We have that already with data.
Yeah.
More and more countries are demanding that the data is only kept in the respective countries, and that is already a massive problem to manage. We still deal with that, but if a technology is separated between two parts of the world, I have no imagination currently how we should run a global business, actually.
Do you want to take on the true or false challenge?
I think it's difficult to add, because I agree, the WTO, I think that would be the frame that we would always sort of stepping up.
If I could push back at Alex Stubb and put you on the spot for a minute, why do you think, I guess that's a true or false question about the US and the EU coming together, but on current evidence, they're on antitrust, on taxation, on data privacy, if anything, they're diverging. You're now seeing the backlash to technology in the US that happened in Europe a lot earlier. But why do you, and that what I read to be the presumption of your question that they are destined to come together, why are you so sure of that? Because on current evidence, that doesn't seem so obvious to me. If you just get the mic back here, yeah.
I think the starting point is linked to a belief in the individual and in privacy. If you look at the way in which people in Europe and even the United States reacted to the revelations on Cambridge Analytica and Facebook using the data, if you look at a lot of the legislation, norms and discussions that are right now linked to privacy in general on both sides of the Atlantic, they're actually pretty close to each other. Yes, you're seeing a lot of competition policy being quite aggressive, or antitrust as we call it in the US, against some of the tech giants in the US. But a lot of the tech giants are actually right now adapting themselves to the, for instance, General Data Protection Directive. And they're doing it not for Florence Nightingale type of stuff. They're doing it because of competition and necessity. On the other side, you have China, which has a completely different approach, I would argue, to the individual and the notion of community and privacy. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but it's very different. What we're seeing now with some of the technological applications determining your social status, whether it's through Alipay or others, you would never, ever see that in the United States or in Europe. So by necessity and by default, I think we will iron out some of the differences between the US and the EU, and to a certain extent, I'm simplifying, gang up against the Chinese. So at the end of the day, it's going to be some of the US-based tech giants, from Facebook to Twitter to Amazon, going against Tencent, Alibaba, and others. And this will be the big sort of technological battle, and I'm sure you will then see the Western world, simplified, going a little bit against China. But that's why I really liked your point on not having two different 5G networks, because this could be a defining moment as well. I'm of course exaggerating, but this would be my case.
Yeah.
And for the same reason, I think if the US and the EU gang up together, it will be a very hard fight. Yeah. Because you've got different set of values in terms of privacy and data and so on in China versus in the Western world.
Yeah. Final point on this. You know, I wrote a Financial Times column a while back, slightly provocatively, for China, Europe is the new Africa. And my argument was that if you looked at a lot of the acquisitions by Chinese companies, either known or unknown, linked to, for instance, intellectual property and otherwise, Europeans just let it go. We didn't have a CFIUS dealing with this. And now you're starting to see a lot of the regulators, whether they're French or otherwise, starting to say that, hey, you know, Ekstron could have gone through the fingers. This would not have been a very good thing. So we're going to start seeing European regulators getting a little bit more aggressive, I think, on this. Interesting enough.
Yeah. So interesting sort of political turn, and maybe it's a funny way that I think Europeans would never admit it, but that sort of the Trump's sort of China bearish policy seems to be rubbing off on Europe. But putting you, Frank, on the spot, you're sort of saying that if the future with 5G, that's China would be a separate entity and would be opting out of globalization, arguably, or making it difficult. But aren't we, in digital terms, already there? I mean, China has its own digital ecosystem. It's got its own champions. Most of the American giants can't really do business there. Isn't it already there in a way?
Yeah, but that's different because that's so far more consumer business anyway, and that we have it in many in retail. If you look into the classical retail, there are many different companies around the world as well. The point is, if you really start connecting the dots, how you deal with data and how you deal with information exchange, and I think we need a new agreement globally with an umbrella. In every country has its own right to interpret what is in addition applicable in the respective country, because we have not everywhere the same government rules, and that's the decision of the citizens of a respective country. So we need to find an agreement, how we deal with that exchange in an environment that we have different governments. It's reality. And, we have no right to say as Western, everything has to be a democracy. That's, we can't do that. We can strive for that. We defend our democracy as Western countries, and we should. That's the reason why the US should be very well aligned with Europe. But we can't rule the world somehow with that. So we need an idea how we align with different systems that we can still work together.
Should we be bringing digital into the conversation about trade more aggressively in a sense? And bringing kind of that we will need a set of, or presumably you will need a set of lowest common denominator perhaps, but sort of common digital rules to make it, and WTO might be a place, I don't know how realistic that is. How would that look even? Yeah.
So there's 72 countries now that have agreed to begin discussing e-commerce in the WTO. We don't know where that's going to head, but it's an important step forward. The trick with e-commerce is that there are a lot of enabling environment issues that are not likely to be something you can have a harmonized global treaty about. They're more about digital payment systems or digital documentation or logistics, facilitating logistics, a range of things where you really need a public-private dialogue, And you need some best practice frameworks, but probably the WTO will handle the principles part of it, kind of a basic level of trade principles, if you will. That's one part of it. The second part is what you just mentioned on the data side, it seems to me. I completely agree with your framework. China has a big interest because it is not simply, those large companies are not selling simply domestically. They are global firms, and they have keen equities, large equities in expanding internationally. Just as Western firms have a big interest in maintaining and expanding production in China. So there's a built-in, I think, common interest in coming up with a kind of framework that you just talked about, which is, can we define certain classes of data which ought to be allowed universally to move because they're commercial, they're non-personal, or they're anonymized personal data that enables big data services that benefit society. And then, as you suggest, presumably there will be areas of policy that will differ by country because of their different cultural norms or different policy preferences that you have to allow for that kind of flexibility. But coming to at least that type of a two-tier or maybe more than two-tier arrangement of identifying a common set of different classes of data that can allow the world economy to be interoperable and operate increasingly as digital plays more of a role and data underlies much of the value chain, that activity that's going on, that's essential. And I think that's, as you suggest, it's got to be a high priority for the way we think about globalization and trade policy going forward.
Does anyone want to weigh in on this digital point or something related to it? Okay, I want to, in the time remaining, in the few minutes we have left, one thing I was struck that my little quiz question on which force is really going to change the world. Let me mention kind of climate change, which you hear about all the time, and we're curious to hear sort of why. Why? How should we be thinking about kind of climate and the future of the world, certainly, but even the future of sort of globalization? It has impacts on migration flows. It is shifting where we're going to get our resources. It's certainly shifting what kind of resources we will consume. So this is more of it's not a one-word answer. I wonder if someone would want to tackle this one.
May I start? So I think the Paris Agreement was a breakthrough, I think, for the world. Now the job is somehow to execute that, and business have to do their own job. We have committed ourselves 2 years ago to really be carbon-free, not carbon-neutral, carbon-free by 2050, despite that we are flying a lot of airplanes. We are generating now the demand. We have our own electric vans developed, which are already 9,000 on the street. So I think that's not a fundamental problem. I'm from education, a chemist. So carbon dioxide and water is the base for, any nature. Plants are doing that on a big scale every day, on a mega scale. So you can reverse that problem if you find the right technology. And I'm very optimistic that we will find the right technology to cope with that problem. The problem is more the short end. What happens to islands? What happens to coast areas? What happens to changes in climate short term? The fundamental belief I have is that this is fixable because the plants are doing that on mega scale every day. With carbon dioxide and water. So that is not an unsolvable problem. It needs commitment from the governments, which we have. Now it needs commitments from the business to generate demand, and then we will find the right technologies to solve it.
If there's I think you put your finger on a really important new phase of global economic integration and policy. The Paris Agreement, in order for it to succeed, we have to think beyond it and build upon it. As the Paris Agreement basically says, countries set your targets, and let's measure and talk about them. But what the action has to happen in the economy, and you don't need a multilateral agreement to try to tackle emissions reductions where they are most important, in the most important countries and the most important industrial sectors. And the new way, this is where trade comes in. A new kind of trade alliance would identify clusters of key firms in key sectors that emit, that agree to remove the competitive disadvantage argument by agreeing on certain common standards or approaches going forward. And if that's done, you begin to have sort of a sectoral build-out of trade understandings in the areas that matter. And then secondly, we have all sorts of trade agreements regionally. Why shouldn't we have a plurilateral, in other words, a subset of countries, link their procurement, their financial system disclosure in respect of climate change, their tariffs, lower tariffs for green products, their standards for what they consider energy efficient equipment, what they want to do on subsidies. This could form a new type of non-regionally specific kind of trade alliance, trade and economic cooperation alliance that would be a big way to advance progress on climate change. But it's a new way of thinking about trade and globalization going forward.
Great. Well, this is actually, I think we've answered all the questions in even a little bit under 1 hour, and we know what to do now. So thank you so much to this panel, and thank you to you all, and have a good evening.